Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Citron Center redistricting event. Today, our topic is redistricting, gerrymandering, in the 2022 congressional election. My name is David Carrillo, and I'm the Executive Director of Berkeley Law's California Constitution Center. Joining me today are Peter Miller, Research Fellow at NYU School of Law's Brennan Center for Justice, Christopher Warshaw, Associate Professor at George Washington University, and Sara Sadwhani, Assistant Professor at Pomona College and Faculty Fellow at USC Schwarzenegger Institute. Our format today is that each speaker after my introduction is going to get 15 minutes to present. All of them are going to be using slides, so we're going to be sharing screens. I'm probably not going to be posing any questions so as not to interrupt the presentations and give them the first full 15 minutes each. But then after the presentations by the individuals, we're going to do a 30-minute or so roundtable. That's going to be general discussion, some Q&A with me, and some crosstalk between us, I'm sure. We'll try to hold about 10 minutes at the end for any audience questions. When we come to that last 10 minutes, if you do want to pose a question, I believe we have the chat feature disabled. So please use the Q&A function to pose any questions. I will quickly review those and pull out as many of them as it looks like we'll have time to deal with in the 10 or 15 minutes or so that we're going to try to reserve for questions. First up is going to be Professor Miller. Professor Miller, if you are ready, I'm going to go ahead and pin you, and you are ready to go.
My name is Peter Miller. As David mentioned, I'm at the Brennan Center for Justice, NYU School of Law. I'll be saying a couple of things about the redistricting process in general, and then dive in sort of a general overview of what we've observed thus far in the redistricting process. I should also emphasize at the outset of my comments that I'm speaking in my capacity as an analyst of redistricting and not necessarily in the institutional voice of the Brennan Center for Justice. So policy advocacy things of the center may touch upon some redistricting reforms that I can address in Q&A, but a lot of the data-driven things will just be my own reflections on what we've observed thus far in the process. So let me just start briefly with this idea of what redistricting is in a general and very sort of 30,000-foot perspective. And in the simplest of terms, redistricting is, as the name suggests, the redrawing of electoral districts across the country. And this is done sort of haphazardly in the beginning of the 20th century, but much more standardized since the so-called redistricting revolution Supreme Court cases in the 1960s. And this has led to a body of federal data that is now sort of developed precisely for the purposes of redistricting. This is the PL 94 data that everyone in redistricting world is quite familiar with. And as a consequence of the Supreme Court cases in this area, the country sort of goes through a process of redrawing all electoral districts, the congressional, legislative, and local districts, and for the purposes of rebalancing these districts in the sake of population growth and contraction in various places. The process itself is governed by both federal and state criteria, in the sense that you have mandatory criteria that applies across the country that's derived from federal sources. And this deals mainly with population equality, meaning districts have to be, for the congressional level, almost exactly the same. And then there is some leeway given for legislative and local districts, but is still in principle designed to minimize the imbalance of population across districts. And then the second major federal criteria is compliance with the Voting Rights Act. And this mainly consists of not depriving racial or ethnic or language minorities of the ability to select representatives of their choice in the redistricting process. States are, of course, able and willing to adopt other criteria that they can use to govern the redistricting process. This is done on a state-by-state level and often varies from state to state. You will often see criteria such as compactness or respect for counties, cities, and other political subunits, protections for communities of interest, a requirement that districts be neutral with the way they treat either parties or candidates for office, among other criteria. You tend to see that states that have commissions of one form or another tend to have more elaborate and more hierarchical criteria, and states that retain the ability to draw districts in the legislature tend to have fewer discrete and explicitly defined criteria. Oregon is one example of a state where you have the legislature draw the maps, but also have a fairly complex set of criteria. And of course, California will have not only a set of criteria, but they're also ranked in terms of hierarchy as a result of the text of the ballot measure that created the redistricting commission in the state. And let me just emphasize at the get-go that redistricting is as close as we get to political blood sport, in the sense that if you want to know, as one lawyer in Houston related to me at one point, about the majesty of American politics, read the Federalist Papers. If you want to know about the reality of redistricting, read The Godfather, in the sense that here you will see competition between the parties for political turf and the ability to draw oneself into a legislative majority that you will see nowhere else in American policymaking. And so that the implications are very high for the parties to perform and make sure that they can do the best they can. And it looks a bit more like the Godfather than actual what perhaps the founders intended when they were debating the Constitution in Philadelphia in the 1700s. So let me start just with a map of the major institutions that draw the congressional districts. And here you can see color-coded that for the large swaths of the country, redistricting is done by state legislatures. There is some experimentation, largely clustered in the Western United States, where you have some form of a commission that is in charge of drawing the maps, and that these reforms are ever so slowly growing eastward, in the sense that you have in California, Arizona, Colorado, and Michigan, unique institutions that are completely divorced, that have completely divorced the process of redistricting from the institution of the legislature, in the sense that legislators in these states play no role in the actual drawing of districts. In these yellow shaded states, including the Pacific Northwest and Washington, Montana, Alaska, and Hawaii, as well as some states in the East, in Virginia and New Jersey, you have what are so-called political appointee commissions, where you have members of legislatures appointing the majority, or in some cases, all of the commissioners that sit on these bodies. So there is at least one degree of removal between the legislature and the act of drawing districts. And then in Ohio, in a unique instance for congressional maps, you actually have a politician commission, where you have active partisan politicians sitting on a commission that draws the districts. And however, in the instance of congressional districting in Ohio in itself, that commission reached an impasse and was unable to draw congressional maps, and that task has now fallen first to the legislature and is now being considered by the courts. When we switch to the legislative districting, the geography stays largely the same, in the sense that we still have independent commissions and political appointee commissions in the West, though we do see some variation in the Midwest and Eastern states, with Arkansas, Missouri, and Pennsylvania joining with some form of a politician commission that is designed to at least somewhat remove the process of the drawing of legislative districts from the legislature themselves. That being said, in the majority of states, you still have the instance where you have active members of a legislature drawing both their own districts and the districts for their colleagues. And so, as we might imagine, with some degree of competition for assignment to committees in the federal Congress, you also see a heightened degree of competition to be able to sit on the redistricting committee in one's own state. And oftentimes the leadership of these committees are held by either longstanding leaders within political parties. What's the role of the courts? We've already seen thus far 55 cases that have been filed in the states in total. The most recent one was actually filed in Kansas yesterday, related to another partisan gerrymandering case. In general, the courts exist to do a couple of things. First, they serve to be a sort of institution of last resort, in the sense that if the political branches or a commission is unable to or unwilling to draw a map, the courts have to step in to ensure that maps that are in place for the midterm elections will be drawn on the basis of population balanced districts. Courts can also—
clarifying question.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry yeah, please go ahead.
Are these federal cases or state court cases?
A combination. The 55 cases are both federal and state. We obviously can split them out by state, but I figured for the purposes of the present conversation, I was just going to give you the top line number. But it reflects a sum of the federal and state challenges.
And are these direct challenges to the maps, or does it also include challenges to the redistricting commission itself in some instances?
I believe all of these are challenges to the either legislative or congressional maps in one way or another. I don't think
to the map.
Yes, the map. This list, I don't think, reflects challenges to, say, the constitutionality of a commission, as was the case in, say, Michigan. I think all of those cases have been resolved.
Right. I mean, there was a case like that in California. So
Yes.
I don't see it. So I was wondering.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think this only relates to the map and not the institution. And furthermore, obviously, all of the partisan gerrymandering cases would only be heard in state courts because the federal courts have been cut out of the partisan gerrymandering question since the Rucho decision a couple of years ago. So at any rate, when you have the courts also exist to answer questions about challenges to the maps made for one reason or another. And these fall into two broad categories. First, partisan gerrymandering, which is one party feels that they have been slighted in the performance of the map and are going to a court to ask for that map to be thrown out. And then there's a variety of cases under which you could have some degree of a racial gerrymander, meaning members of one minority group have their vote diluted in the sense that their ability to select a representative of their choice is being impinged upon by the configuration of a district. So a nice example of that would be the racial gerrymandering claims that have been raised in the congressional map in Alabama, where Black folks have said that they are, as a function of population of the state, owed a second congressional district, and the state has disagreed with that. And then the Supreme Court will now be hearing that case in the fall to try and adjudicate the legitimacy of that claim. And so that would fall under one of these varieties of the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, this third column in this figure. But there are a variety of ways in which racial gerrymandering claims can be made before a state. And as you can see from the table, there doesn't seem to be any sort of cluster in, say, one state or another. These claims tend to be universal and tend to be common for all sorts of redistricting cycles. Thus far, it doesn't seem like the 2020 redistricting cycle is atypical in the sense of the volume of cases that we've seen relative to earlier cycles. So let me just make a couple of comments about partisan gerrymandering, which is to say, how can we demonstrate that a given map in a state benefits one party over the other? There have been a variety of statistical and social science measures that have been developed over time to try and address this question. And I think the oldest is the partisan symmetry measure. This was developed, I believe, in the 80s. Most is closely associated with Gary King at Harvard. The efficiency gap is a measure that's a bit more recent. It was the so-called sociological gobbledygook that Chief Justice Roberts referred to in the Gill v. Whitford case out of Wisconsin. And then there are also instances of measures from this mean median difference, looking at vote shares among the parties, as well as declination, where you have the distribution of seats within a state that have been developed recently. All of these measures can be used to demonstrate that one party is, say, winning more seats than they should on the basis of the distribution of votes. And the good news is that all of these measures tend to be highly correlated one to the other. And here I can rely upon the impressive expert witness that Chris Warshaw submitted in the Ohio legislative challenge, where he demonstrated this in his expert witness. So I'll leave all the technical questions to him. The U.S. Supreme Court has, as David implied in the question that we were chatting about in the previous slide, struggled with some of these mathematical concepts. However, other federal and state courts have been able to use these measures in social science literature generally to be able to strike down maps on the basis of partisan bias. And most recently, the state Supreme Court in North Carolina based their decision to strike down both the congressional and legislative maps in that state on representations that were made to the court based on these measures and other social science indicators of, say, the seats to votes curve and these sorts of things that try and translate the vote to potential seats. The Freedom to Vote Act is a piece of federal legislation. It was in this bundle of reforms that would have been passed by the Senate, except for the filibuster. And the Freedom to Vote Act is one vehicle that tries to define partisan gerrymandering in federal law. One point that was raised in the Rucho case was that there is no standard for partisan gerrymandering. And this piece of legislation tries to elucidate one by looking at if there is bias in seats that are won when we plug state and Senate election results into a given district plan. In essence, we use statewide elections to try and estimate how a district plan would operate. And what do we see when we apply these data to congressional and legislative plans? A map that looks a little bit like this. Here you have first in this sort of dark gray color, this at-large states. These are states that for whom congressional redistricting is simple. The lightly colored blue states are places that have finished the congressional districting process, and yet we do not detect partisan bias in those plans. And then when we look at these orange colored states, these are states in which the congressional map does exhibit partisan bias in one direction or another. And so a nice example of this in the Democratic direction would be Illinois or New York, famously both states in which the legislature tried to take a land grab to maximize the benefit for Democrats in the congressional maps. But you also see this in Republican-leaning states like Georgia and Texas. Let me then
about 5 minutes, Peter.
5 minutes, great. I'm almost done. And then here's a similar picture for the legislative maps. In essence, we still see the same thing. The measure that's provided by the Freedom to Vote Act may be a bit too permissive in these instances, but we still see states that would be triggered as potentially having partisan bias under the terms of the test as in the Freedom to Vote Act text. Can we make any sense of the pattern that we observed thus far? Yes, I think a couple of things come out. One is that legislatures have a hard time drawing fair congressional maps. About 50% of the legislative plans would trigger the Freedom to Vote Act's presumption of partisan bias. Commissions do a better job, but the problem is that we see fewer commissions out there. And we see a variety of commissions that perhaps make it difficult. So the media in particular seems to think that all commissions are independent, particularly when they have the word independent in the title, even when they're not independent of the legislature. So for example, you can see Washington and New Jersey's appointed commissions behave differently. The Washington Commission drew a fair map. The New Jersey Commission drew a partisan map. And in essence, but they're both commissions. However, when we look at the independent commissions, those 4 states of Arizona, California, Colorado, and Michigan, only the Arizona plan would trigger the Freedom to Vote Act. And even there, it's by the barest of margins. And also most concerning, 2 of the 5 court-drawn maps would also trigger the Freedom to Vote Act. At the legislative level, things are even more tilted to suggest that legislatures are not equipped to handle this question. So up to 60% of the plans drawn by the legislature would trigger for partisan bias for at least one of these chambers. Plans drawn by courts and independent commissions do very well. However, other commissions would still trigger a presumption of partisan bias in 4 of the 7 states in which some form of commission that is dependent on the legislature in one way or another is present. So in short, redistricting tends to present a sort of intractable conflict of interest, I think, for legislatures to deal with. And we're starting to see that in the way in which we can assess how these maps behave. If you want fair maps, independent commissions tend to do a better job. And I'm sure Sara can elucidate some of those details in her remarks. So I'll wrap up there and yield back the floor. Thank you.
That's fantastic. You're right on time. Go ahead and unshare your screen, please. And Professor Warshaw, you are up to bat. Go ahead and share your screen and let's start your slides.
Great. Well, I'm very pleased to be here today on this really terrific panel on an event that I think is talking about a really important topic in American politics. So I want to give you I want to cover a couple pieces in my remarks. So first, I just want to give a broad overview of why we should care about redistricting. I think like Peter's presentation sort of in some ways like presupposed that this is important. And I just want to give you a little bit of evidence to tell you why you should care about redistricting. And then I want to give sort of follow up on some of Peter's remarks and give some more information about where we are in the 2021-22 redistricting cycle and how the plans across the country are looking so far, both in terms of their partisan fairness, but also in terms of the percentage of districts where minorities can influence the outcome. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about sort of why do the new maps maybe look a little bit more fair than some expected before this cycle. So I'll sort of give a couple reasons there, and then hopefully that'll motivate us for our discussion later on. So to give a little bit of background, in my academic work with Devin Coey, we've done work to measure the partisan bias in redistricting plans in both state legislative elections and in some other work I've done in congressional elections since the 1970s and before. And what we found is that the partisan bias, the magnitude of the partisan bias in plans, which in these graphs here, I measure using the efficiency gap, which is one of the metrics that Peter mentioned And it's basically the ratio of wasted votes between Democrats and Republicans. So if we look at the absolute magnitude of the efficiency gap, there was far more partisan bias in the malapportionment era in the 1940s, 50s, and even the 1960s than today. And in the wake of one person, one vote, one of the many things that one person, one vote improved is it made the districting process more fair between the parties. And unfortunately, it didn't totally eradicate partisan gerrymandering. And what you see on the graph on the left here is that there's many states where one party or the other has an advantage in the redistricting process. And that's always been true to a certain degree, but it continues to be true today. And we've seen some of the most extreme gerrymanders in history, particularly on the Republican side of the aisle in the last decade. So I think one of the big questions for academics are what are the consequences of this redistricting, of this gerrymandering for the political process? And then a big question both for academics and for all of us before this redistricting cycle was how is all of this going to play out in 2021 and 22? So I think one big question is, so you might say, okay, there's all of this partisan gerrymandering in the redistricting process, but is it actually, or there's all this, let me reframe, there's all of this partisan bias in the redistricting process, but is it due to geography or is it due to intentional gerrymandering? And many argue that geographic concentrations, Democrats and Republicans give one party or the other sort of a natural advantage in some states. And while no doubt that's true to a certain degree, what Devin and I tried to look at in our book project was how much does partisan control of government shift the bias in the maps in favor of the party that controls the redistricting process. And what we found was that both before and after the one person, one vote eras, controlling the redistricting process gives you a really big advantage when you draw the maps. And that advantage did diminish a little bit in the wake of one person, one vote after 1970. But even in recent years, if you control all three branches of government, you might be able to draw maps that have an efficiency gap that are 10 percentage points more in your favor than if you hadn't controlled all three branches of government. And this obviously gives the party that happens to control the government a big say in the maps, or in the future composition of the government, both in the short term, but also in the long term. Now, next you might say, okay, well, just because the party is able to gain a partisan advantage, does that actually affect the ideological composition of the state legislature and of the policymaking process? And so the next thing we did is we tried to look at, based on some terrific work that Boris Shore and Nolan McCarty did, to tabulate the ideal points of state legislators over the past 3 decades. We looked at whether a partisan advantage in the districting process shifted the average ideology of state legislators in a certain direction. And what we found was that when there was a pro-democratic bias in the maps, the state legislature got substantially more liberal. And when there was a pro-Republican advantage in the maps, the state legislature gets more conservative. Which on one hand, probably isn't super surprising, but I think the magnitude of that effect is quite large. So that if you have the difference between having a negative 10% efficiency gap and a positive 10% efficiency gap is about 0.4 standard deviations in terms of the median ideology of the state legislature, which is reasonably large. And next we looked at the effect on the policies that states actually pass. Because at the end of the day, it's interesting what the ideological composition of the state legislature is, but I think for many of us, the ultimate metric of a democracy is what are the policies that the government actually passes. So what we found is that over the last 60 years, when you compare the partisan bias in the districting process to the actual policies states pass, when there's a pro-democratic efficiency gap, states pass more liberal policies. And when there's a pro-Republican efficiency gap, states pass more conservative policies. So, my takeaway is that the redistricting process matters. This isn't just inside baseball. This doesn't just matter for, who wins elections. This actually affects the kinds of things that our government is able to do in the democratic process across the country. And then finally, the last piece that Devin and I looked at in our book is that we try to assess, instead of looking at the bias that the maps introduce, trying to get a sense for whether if you have more unfair maps, does it actually degrade the democratic representation? And there's a number of ways that scholars have tried to tabulate democratic representation and try to measure it. But two of the most common are trying to evaluate whether state policies are congruent with what a majority of the people want, and what percentage of the people actually agree with the state policies that have been passed. So these are two fairly straightforward metrics. They have their pluses and minuses, but overall, they give us a reasonably good picture, I think, of how strong our democracy is working. And what we found is that when you pass unfair maps, it degrades the democratic process. It leads to state policies that are less congruent with what a majority of the people want. And it leads to state policies that are supported by a smaller percentage of the public. So unfair maps don't just bias the democratic process in favor of one party, but they also degrade the political representation for all Americans. So in my view, the redistricting process and partisan gerrymandering is one of the most important issues in American politics. And in order to safeguard our democracy, it's really important to take the politics out of map drawing and try to have fair maps, both in Congress, but around the country. So turning to 2021, just reiterating some of the things that Peter said, I think that, I think that many people sort of expected there to be supercharged gerrymandering, possibly cementing Republican advantages. And the reasons for that, I think, were fairly straightforward. For one, the federal courts have basically completely abdicated their role in reining in partisan gerrymandering. There continues to be both motivation and tools for partisan actors to draw gerrymandered maps. And in the wake of both 2010 and then 2020, Republicans have controlled far more states than Democrats. So they have the ability to draw more gerrymandered maps than Democrats do. But on the other side of the ledger, there's some reasons to think that maybe this wouldn't be quite so bad. There's more nonpartisan commissions now than in the past. Several large states have divided government now, such as Pennsylvania, that didn't have divided government before, and Wisconsin in the Midwest. Moreover, there's a lot of advocacy and work around redistricting, and much more so than in 2011. And the role of that, as well as the state courts, was somewhat unclear, but maybe that might be able to rein things in. So to give you a sense of what's happened so far, I've done preliminary analysis in conjunction with two colleagues of mine, Eric McGee and Mike McGursky. And we've used a website that we've been involved in designing the social science foundation for, called planscore.org. And so PlanScore enables you to upload a map, and you can evaluate both the seat shares for each party, as well as a variety of partisan fairness metrics. And the nice thing about PlanScore is we can do an apples to apples comparison between the old maps and the new maps using exactly the same metrics and exactly the same way of aggregating the votes. So the only thing that's different here is the old versus the new maps. So what do we find? Well, first, looking at partisan fairness, here using the efficiency gap, but you find similar results using other metrics. The new maps look pretty similar to the old maps. On the x-axis here, you have the efficiency gap in the 2020 maps. And on the y-axis, you have the efficiency gap of the new plans. And this is only showing you plans that have passed for state legislature and Congress. And what we see is that, on the bottom half of the graph are Republican plans, which show that they have a pro-Republican bias, the plans in red. The blue state abbreviations are Democratic past plans. They typically have a pro-Democratic bias. And then what you see is clustered in the middle of the graph are plans passed by nonpartisan commissions or bipartisan commissions, as well as by courts. And what you see is that on average, the plans passed by commissions tend to be more fair, as well as the plans passed by courts. For instance, in Michigan, had one of the larger pro-Republican advantages in the country, especially for Congress, in the early part of last decade, and as well as for state legislature. And the nonpartisan commission there made those plans much more fair than they had been in the previous cycle. And we can see the same thing in places where courts have drawn the maps. So overall, I think that there's some at least preliminary evidence here that nonpartisan commissions make a difference and make the maps more fair. And how do things look nationwide? Well, nationwide, the efficiency gap went from a pro-Republican efficiency gap of about 1.5 percentage points for state legislative maps to a little bit less than that for the in the new plans. And in Congress, we went from a 2.6% pro-Republican efficiency gap to a plus 0.18 or a 1.8% pro-Republican efficiency gap. So the new maps still lean Republican. Republicans still have an advantage in the translation of votes to seats. If the national vote splits 50-50, Republicans will almost surely win control of Congress, for instance. However, the maps are a little bit more fair than they were last decade. And I actually think they're substantially more fair than they were in 2012. And I'm happy to talk about that during the Q&A or the roundtable.
About 5 minutes. Great.
There's also been a lot of discussion of the competitiveness of the new maps, which we can analyze separately from partisan fairness. And many have argued that the new maps are substantially less competitive than the old maps. And we actually don't see that in our analysis. We think that the new maps are a little bit less competitive, but especially at the congressional level, Texas is really an outlier, where the Texas plan substantially reduced the number of competitive districts, such that it basically locked in Republican power in Texas to be almost impervious to shifts in the statewide vote. But in other states, we actually don't see a lot of change. But again, what you see is that most of the plans that have the most competitive districts, particularly at the congressional level, were the ones drawn by commissions or courts. In general, the plans drawn by the parties tend to have fewer competitive districts. That's particularly true for Republicans, but it's also true in some of the Democratic plans. Next, turning aside from partisan fairness, we can also try to think about whether the new plans give racial minorities the ability to win a fair share of districts. And what we see, so on this graph, I compare the percentage of the statewide citizen voting age population for African Americans to the percentage of districts where at least 40% of the CVAP is Black. And what you see is that in most states, they are roughly parallel to each other. Although in a number of Republican-led states, minorities tend to be underrepresented, with South Carolina and Alabama being sort of the most egregious at the congressional level. And in general, I think that Blacks tend to be somewhat underrepresented, especially for state legislatures. For Hispanics, the situation is even worse, that Hispanics tend to be substantially underrepresented in both state legislative plans and to only slightly lesser degree congressional plans. One positive outlier here is California, which really seems to have done a terrific job building, crafting districts where Hispanics really do get a chance to win districts in the same proportion as their share of the statewide population. But in most other states, there tend to be fewer Hispanic influenced districts than the Hispanic share of the state population. So turning back to partisan fairness, I just want to briefly reflect on why are the new maps slightly more fair than expected. I don't want to be too positive about this. They're still somewhat biased toward Republicans, and they're not perfectly fair. And they're certainly not as fair as they would have been if we'd passed federal legislation. But nonetheless, I do think they're better than they were last decade, and they're certainly better than many expected. So I think one factor is the growth of nonpartisan commissions, with new commissions in Michigan, Colorado, and I think Virginia seem to have made some difference. In our academic work, Devin Coey and I find that nonpartisan commissions essentially over the last 50 years basically break the link between partisan control of the redistricting process and the partisan bias in the maps, so that in states that have nonpartisan or bipartisan commissions, there's essentially no relationship between which party controls state government and the bias that emerges from the redistricting process. So I think there's clearly, both from our, academic work over the last 50 years, but also just staring at some of these plots, the states with nonpartisan commissions clearly have more fair maps. So I think that's made a difference. Another factor, I think, is litigation and advocacy that's been done across the country. State courts in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina have put in place, or on the verge of putting in place, more fair maps for either Congress or state legislature. And I think courts have also played roles in other states as well. Whereas Okay, last decade, that litigation really took until toward the end of the decade to play out. And this decade, it's happened much faster. And I think finally, just to wrap up, I think the last really big innovation this decade has been more nonpartisan analytic tools, so that scholars and advocates and just everyday public can really analyze these redistricting plans in almost real time, using tools like Dave's Redistricting app, Plan Score, as well as the Princeton Gerrymandering Project and many others. There's just this whole suite of tools where we can know in real time what these state legislatures are doing in ways that we really couldn't before. So with that, I'll thank you, and I'm looking forward to the roundtable and discussion.
Super, thank you. Professor Sadwhani.
Yes, thank you. And this is really great, really exciting to see all this research happening from across the country. My comments today are predominantly going to be more so of a practical nature, thinking about my position, not only as a professor of political science, but as having served as a commissioner on the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. Are you all seeing those slides okay?
Yep.
Perfect. Wonderful. So, again, today, mostly I'm going to be focusing on the process of the commission. What does it actually take for a commission to draw lines in a public fashion? My colleagues here laid out a strong case for why we should care about, why redistricting is important, why we should care about it. And from the perspective of a commission, what we were thinking about is, what does it take to actually get people to care, right? And our answer to that was participation. And so, much of the work that we did in the commission, of course, was around line drawing, but even in advance of that, of really getting Californians involved in the process to the greatest extent possible. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So first, I just wanted to start off with a little bit of the commission history in California. Prior to 2010, much as it continues to be in many other states, legislators drew the lines. And if the legislators failed in that task, then of course it goes to the courts. In 2008, at the time, we had Governor Schwarzenegger, a Republican, in the governor's seat. And there was a strong push by Schwarzenegger in conjunction and collaboration with good governance groups like Common Cause and the League of Women Voters to push for Prop 11, the Voters First Act, which would create a commission to draw the lines for the state legislature. And that was a highly contentious position. In fact, at that point in time, Democrats who held the majority in the state legislature opposed the movement to a commission, feeling like, hey, they've got the power. Why on earth would you give that up? But the voters felt differently and passed Prop 11. 2 years later, Prop 20 also added congressional districts to the portfolio that the Citizens Redistricting Commission would take on. And in 2010 and 2011, the first commission was seated to take on this new experiment in democracy. And they were very successful, right? In cleaning up the district lines, taking a fair and impartial approach to line drawing. And I think one of the key components that commissions bring is bringing it out from under the shadows. When legislators are drawing the lines, it's typically done in a back room with consultants in which the public never has an opportunity to know why lines were drawn the way that they were, or to provide any input into the process or where their own communities lie. I think that's a real value that commissions can bring, is this greater involvement in the process, right? And at the end of the day, this is a key component to our democracy and to our democratic process. And so shouldn't we want to have more people involved? Of course, in 2020, the commission was back. A new set of commissioners was selected through a lengthy process. For myself, I get asked all the time, why on earth did you apply to serve on this commission? It's so much work. It's like literally thousands of hours of work that went into this process. There were more than 20,000 initial applicants. I can't say that I had a strong, deep desire to necessarily serve on the commission going into it, but there had been an LA Times article, I recall, in 2019, and when those application period opened, talking about the lack of diversity in the applicant pool. I had actually just finished my PhD and knew a whole lot about voting trends in California. And I had also had a background working in many communities of color throughout the state, having worked in social justice at advocacy organizations in the past. So I was very well aware of the process. I had a sense of the stakes that are involved. I was also a fellow at the USC Schwarzenegger Institute. So of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger was very enthusiastic when I said that I would put my name in. And lo and behold, through a very lengthy process that required writing essays, having letters of recommendation, public comment, having the legislature strike people that they saw as potentially being too partisan, I found myself still on the list at the end of the process when the state auditor's office takes a bunch of what do you call it, ping pong balls, lottery balls, and selects the first 8 commissioners. And that's how I was selected. And I often like to joke that I never win anything. I never play the lottery because I'm always a loser in the lottery. But that was my lucky day, I suppose. Within the state of California, there's a number of redistricting efforts that occur. And so, one of the key components here was making clear the mandate of the commission. And for the state's commission, that was the congressional lines, the state legislature, including the Senate and Assembly, and also our Board of Equalization. I think one of the areas where there's definitely possibilities to do more innovation in the future is potentially aligning some of the messaging or some of the tools that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes with other redistricting efforts that are happening around the state. So across the state, there are 58 counties that engage in their own processes of redistricting. Cities often have their own different kinds of processes, some cities having commissions themselves, school districts, as well as other redistricting efforts at other municipalities. So to some extent, some of the challenges of getting folks involved in this process also comes down to some of the messaging that has to go into it. Given the time frame that we had, it was a unique year in 2020 and 2021. Of course, we saw an incredible delay in census data. And in many ways, that was a blessing for the commission. It allowed us to do an extensive outreach campaign to go around to different communities across the state. And hopefully try to provide some education about what redistricting is, why they should get involved, and also share with folks on the ground how they can get involved and what kinds of information that they needed. And in terms of that information, there's a whole host of information that goes into the redistricting process. And Peter and Chris talked a little bit about some of these different criteria and things like the efficiency gap and thinking about competitiveness and other kinds of partisan considerations when redistricting. But here in California, the state law makes it very clear that partisan considerations cannot and should not be made. The state, in the language of the Voters First Act, the propositions that were passed, it very clearly established ranked criteria that the commission had to follow. The first criteria, of course, being equal population. And for all of the redistricting wonks that are out there listening, I'm sure you'll know about the Supreme Court case of Baker v. Carr, which establishes the need to have equal population in the districts. And this is laid out in our state law, right? So we see this reflection of federal law in our criteria. The second, of course, is adherence to the Voting Rights Act. And we've heard a little bit about the talk of, oh, sorry, my lights, of course, went out just now. We heard a little bit about the talk about the creation of majority minority districts and influence districts. We can talk more about the specifics of the Voting Rights Act and, the adherence to Section 2. in Q&A as well. But this became a major component for us here in California. As Chris talked about in other states, often the Voting Rights Act, and for those who don't know less about the Voting Rights Act, you might think about the civil rights movement and the passage of the Voting Rights Act as exemplified in the Selma film, or knowing your history a little bit of the civil rights era. And of course, the VRA has transformed over time in many ways and applies to many different communities. In California, predominantly when we're thinking about VRA considerations, we're generally thinking about them in terms of Latino communities, though we did do an assessment for other historically excluded minority communities to see if, when, and where we might need to be thinking about the creation of Section 2 districts. And
about 4 minutes left.
Oh, okay. Thank you. A third piece is contiguity, but what I really want to, and that's simply keeping districts together, but what I really wanted to focus on was communities of interest. And I think this is one of the areas where we get perhaps the most pushback, and this question of what is a community of interest. And notably, communities of interest rank at the same level as maintaining city and county boundaries, right? In state law, it very clearly outlines a fairly broad definition of communities of interest having economic or social ties. And that really means communities get to call in and tell us where their community lies. And throughout the process, we spent the entirety of the summer of 2021 conducting hearings to hear from communities about where their communities lie, and continue to get a ton of testimony throughout the line drawing process. In total, we had more than 40,000 pieces of information that were submitted to the commission. Very quickly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of that outreach and some of the tools that were developed, because I think these are some of the incredible components that come out of the commission process that certainly could be replicated in other states in the future, or even in local municipalities. As I mentioned, we were conducting public input sessions throughout the summer of 2021. We spent often 4 or 5 days a week on Zoom, given the pandemic conditions, just collecting hours and hours of testimony. There were a number of tools that we developed, including Draw My Community of Interest, Draw My COI, or Draw My District, in which community members could go in and use a fairly simple platform. And we had live chat support for folks run through the statewide database to submit their community of interest, to draw a map of where their community lies and why they want it to be kept together, and submit it directly to the commission. Similarly, once census data was available, community members could develop their own district map ideas and submit those to the commission for consideration. And then another key component to our entire commission process was live line drawing. In many other states, you'll see consultants being hired who develop a plan and then present it to either lawmakers or commissioners for their consideration. Here in California, however, we did all of the line drawing in public in live sessions. So the public could literally watch as we changed from one census block to another, the shape of a district, and could hear all of the deliberation and that goes into that. We had a lot of pushback against the commission during the process of people arguing that it was messy, but democracy is always going to be messy. And so I don't see it so much as messy, but instead as a beautiful democratic process in which we saw 14 commissioners from all different walks of life taking on this task, weighing our options, looking at all of the different possibilities, and finally coming to some agreement that we could advance. And of course, before I end, I just wanted to show you all of my colleagues. We had an incredible set of 14 commissioners from all different walks of life. And I think one of the things that I can't speak on behalf of everyone, but one of the things that makes me so proud is that despite all of our differences, we were able to come together, work off of consensus, and pass our maps unanimously and on time, and thus far have received 0 legal challenges to our maps. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We are now going to move into the roundtable section. So what I propose to do is that since, oh wait, what happened to you? Professor Miller, come back. Your video got turned off at exactly the wrong minute. I was gonna walk through my questions for each of you in order, but let me take Professor Warshaw out of order since what happened to? Okay, you can see Peter.
Am I back? Can you see me?
Yeah, there you are.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
Okay. Never mind. Let's just go with the gallery. Okay. Okay. So, Professor Miller, one of the things I took away from the first set of maps you showed is that a majority of states use legislative redistricting. The minority is the something else, an independent commission or an appointed commissioner or something like, anything other than the legislature doing it. But what I wasn't able to draw from your maps was whether there was any overlay. What's the similarity between the non-legislative redistricting states? Like, is there any commonality among those groups? I initially wanted to overlay it with, are those all direct democracy states? And they are all except for Hawaii. So I was wondering, is some kind of independent commission a common feature of the direct democracy states versus states that don't have that? But the map doesn't exactly true up that way. So,
right.
So I question that overlay. Do you have an overlay?
So I think that one of the best predictors of if a state is adopting an independent commission, or any commission in particular, is the provision of direct democracy. And you tend to see the commissions that are in place, with the exception of Hawaii and New Jersey's, being adopted by some form of either initiative or referendum. So, varyingly, the Montana rewrote its constitution in 1972, and that commission, the commission in Montana was written into the constitution at that point in time. The constitution was then ratified by the people. You tend to see these commissions in Western states precisely because Western states have direct democracy. Nate Persley, in his article, The Peculiar Geography of Direct Democracy, makes this point that the popular ratification of state constitutions sort of puts a different shade of politics in the Western United States. And
so it's interesting to me that Oregon wasn't one of the independent commissions.
Yes. Yeah, precisely.
Why not Oregon? It's a classic direct democracy state.
Yeah, I mean, given the lengthy ballot of 32 ballot measures that they're voting on or whatever time, and Oregon is an outlier in that regard. It's true. There is an effort to try and establish an independent commission in the state. There was in the last cycle. It was a subject to litigation and has now in abeyance for the moment. But I think they're going to try and reinvigorate that effort.
Can you maybe explain it as it hasn't been a sufficiently grave problem that it's been the subject of an initiative, or have there been attempts at establishing in Oregon and they've just failed?
Yeah, I mean, one of the other anecdotal things is you need some sort of pre-motivating crisis to demonstrate here's the importance of the commission. I think California, the nice example here is that the 2000 map is widely regarded as a great example of a bipartisan gerrymander. If you want to effectively make elections into this sort of ceremonial aspect that doesn't have any impact on who actually governs, look at the congressional map in California. In the course of the 2000s, one seat changes parties in 2006. So wave elections either in favor of the Democrats in 2008 or in favor of the Republicans in 2010 have no impact on the change in the composition of the congressional delegation. That irritates the people of California, and I think that directly relates to why people realize legislatures should not have the task of drawing districts.
So another one of your slides that really jumped out at me, and I asked you a question about this, and apologize for interrupting you, it was your roundup of the judicial challenges, and I noticed California wasn't on it. There have been challenges in California to the Redistricting Commission, and also substantive challenges to its maps. So I know a fair amount about the litigation in California, but what I don't know anything about is the litigation in other states. So I can tell you, California Supreme Court, on a couple of instances, had to draw the maps themselves because the legislature failed to agree on them, and that was exactly the precipitating crisis that ultimately was the inspiration for establishing the Redistricting Commission here. What's been the reaction to courts in other states when there have been problems in the redistricting process? Have courts in other states had to draw the lines themselves? What's been the general treatment in the judicial treatment in other states to challenges or issues in the redistricting process?
Yeah, you tend to see the courts operate in a variety of different ways. And one is that they can sort of step in when the political branches fail, in the sense that, if a legislature deadlocks or a governor vetoes a bill and the legislature is unable to override that veto, the responsibility of drawing the lines falls to the courts, just as an institution of last resort. But you'll also see instances where a map is challenged for one reason or another and the court stepping in, and that might also include a remedy of, yes, we agree that current existing map should be thrown out. We replace it with a map of either our own design or one of the plaintiffs. And I think a nice example here is actually the congressional map that the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania threw out in 2018 on partisan grounds, because there they retained the services of a special master, again, Nate Persily. And he drew,
California Supreme Court also uses special master.
Right. Yeah. The special master just being a sort of judicial officer, right, to help advise the justices. Because as far as I know, judges don't really enjoy the task of redistricting.
No. And that was part of the thrust of my question. Is it was pretty obvious that on the occasions when the California Supreme Court had to deal with this, they wanted nothing to do with it. And outsourcing it to a special master was really the only way that the court could do that.
Right. And one, it's a very complicated area of both law and policy. And two, this is not something that people go to law school studying redistricting. You might know the litigation of it, but then they'd be completely unfamiliar with, say, the software of either Maptitude or QGIS or some of these other software packages that are out there to actually draw the maps. So you could.
Yeah, that would definitely be me. I don't know anything about
that. Yeah, exactly. But I mean, at the end result in the Pennsylvania instance is that the map that Nate Persily drew was partisan neutral. And it took a map that was, I think, by all regards, a partisan gerrymander and turned it into a neutral map. And that was an instance where the court sort of interjected itself and brought peace to the two warring tribes, so to speak.
Well, and I think that gets to the major takeaway that you referred to, and it was also my high level takeaway from looking at your slides was twofold. One is that the bias map, I think, is strong evidence that both parties will try to achieve a partisan advantage. There's no one good party or bad party. They're all politicians. They're all going to try to achieve an advantage with a map if they have a chance. That's one takeaway. And then the other is sort of the corollary principle is that only nonpartisan entities can draw nonpartisan maps. And that nonpartisan entity could be an independent commission or it could be a court. But basically, anyone other than a politician is the only person or entity that can draw a nonpartisan map. Do you think that's fair?
Yes. I think in the sense that it's not a function of partisanship in terms of who draws biased maps. It's rather who has the ability. So if you have one party running the process, and the Republicans famously did very well in the 2010 both congressional and legislative elections, that set the stage for the acrimonious 2010 redistricting cycle because the Republicans had united control in more states. One explanation that Chris sort of alluded to is that why the redistricting we're seeing in this cycle is less extreme is in part because the previous Republican trifectas in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania have been disrupted. Michigan even went so far as to adopt an independent commission entirely. So I don't think it's one party is at fault here. It's just who controls the levers of power. But the other point in your question is this sort of anti-democratic in the sense that you have people who are not accountable to the voters then drawing the maps. But I think that's precisely the point. And this might be a complicated point of direct democratic theory to express, but precisely because representatives are subject to re-election and the need to put together a majority in their districts, they are unable to do this task. And you can only have people who are not accountable to the voters, who sort of show up, do a task, and then go home, like Sara taking time off from her teaching schedule in order to help draw these districts in California, is the only way that you are able to separate the task of drawing a district from the almost unavoidable tendency of representatives to seek re-election.
Yeah, just to clarify, I was teaching a full load while drawing.
I'm sorry. So while
even more impressive,
both tending to her students and the fate of California,
yeah, it really seems to me like the key characteristic you need in order to be able to draw a fair map is disinterest in the outcome.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, right. Because otherwise, I think you'll have your finger on the scale one way or the other. Yeah,
I mean it's human nature. Okay,
if I may, I don't think it's about disinterest in the outcome. I think it's a shift in what that outcome is. Right, from a commissioner's perspective, it's not that we didn't care what the outcome was. There was a real deep desire and concern amongst commissioners, many of whom, came from backgrounds in community organizing and nonprofit, work, that had a real concern to ensure fair representation for communities on the ground. And we didn't spend thousands of hours taking in testimony and obsessing over each census block just for the fun of it, because we didn't care about the outcome, but instead because we wanted to ensure fair maps for the most number of people possible. We were getting a ton of testimony. Of course, as I mentioned, the Latino community tends to be the community that we were looking at from many of our VRA districts, but also from Asian Americans, from Black communities, from LGBT communities, from business districts, from folks connected through waterways, through mountains. So I don't think it was about disinterest, but I do think it was about fair representation.
Well, maybe it's better to phrase it as the relevant interest is one in the greater good, and not personal profit motive, and defining personal profit as keeping an elected position or a job.
Sure.
Is that fair to say? Since I already have you pinned, Professor Warshaw, if you don't mind, let me just continue with Professor Sadwhani, and then you can be our closeout. So Professor Sadwhani, thank you for your presentation about your experience on the Redistricting Commission, and thank you for your public service. It certainly sounds like it was a labor of Hercules. What I was wondering about was, as a result of that process, did you find any reason why a state would not adopt a redistricting commission? Was there anything about the process that you found didn't work as well as it could have, and that another entity or another way of approaching this problem occurred to you could have been better?
I don't think it has to do with the process of the commission. I think going back to the conversation you were having earlier with Peter, maybe I'm biased as a political scientist, but I think it's about power, right? In why on earth would a state give up its power to redistrict? Why would a legislature just choose to give up their ability to redistrict unless there's a ballot initiative, unless there's a direct democracy kind of push for it? I think there is a good governance, a general movement towards it. But certainly we're not seeing other states kind of take on this task. So I think, for states like California and other places, it's largely due to those changes, not about the specifics of how the commission is set up. Though I think that we need to pay a lot of attention to how the commissions are established. California, we have an even balance between Democrats, Republicans, 5 and 5, and then 4 independents.
On the commission.
On the commission, yeah. There's a lot of pushback about why on earth is that the setup, given the fact that registered Republicans are actually fewer than registered independents or no party preference. We operated on a system that we selected our chair, and we use a rotating chair system. A chair can play an enormous role in guiding the process of the commission. In Arizona, my understanding is that the chair is the independent and selected, and is a selected individual. That's an enormous amount of pressure to put on someone who ultimately has the final vote, right? Who can guide the process in such an enormous way. So I think there's a lot of the compositional components to, and the institutional constraints of a commission that need to be considered. But I don't think that necessarily determines whether or not a state is going to adopt them.
Well, you raise an interesting point about representativeness. Our colleagues have referred to the debate or questions about the degree to which an independent commission like California's is a democratic process itself. So you raised the question of to what degree does the commission itself have to be representative when the whole point of it is to create a process for selecting representatives in a democratic government. So it's a little bit circular. How representative does it have to be of the representatives we're going to choose to represent us? So so that's a concern. The other concern that you mentioned is the reality that people in power are usually reluctant to give it up. And I discussed with our colleagues that one way in which that can happen in this context is through direct democracy. And since I studied direct democracy, it is very interesting to me that there is not a perfect overlay, but a pretty close overlay of the states that have done this are states with the initiative power. So what's your perception of these two things? To what extent do you feel like the commission exists only because it does have that direct mandate through the direct democracy process here in California? And do you feel like that's something without which a commission like this, it just simply won't exist?
Yeah, I mean, just to take that question on first, I mean, I think it's very similar to the one previous. Yeah, I think direct democracy is the way that states arrive or tend to arrive at these in the adoption of a commission. Unless there's a federal mandate, right? Which I think Peter had laid out that there is legislation that is attempting to create commissions, independent commissions in all 50 states, but the likelihood of that moving forward in today's Congress is probably fairly limited. In terms of
that's also part and parcel with the idea that there needs to be some external force that imposes it. It's not going to originate organically from within the legislature.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. I think that's correct. In terms of representativeness, I mean, you're asking an REP scholar that, right? So to me, representation matters. And that was most certainly a consideration for this commission. As a part of the first 8 commissioners that were selected through a lottery ball process, it became major news that throughout the state, at least amongst folks that follow redistricting, but that the first 8 didn't have anyone on the commission of Latino descent in a state in which Latinos
40%.
Right, absolutely right. Have a huge number of political interests, and certainly from a VRA perspective, there was a lot of concern about whether or not having no Latinos on a commission would be problematic for the outcomes for the Latino community. So, from the beginning, especially for myself, I thought it was absolutely important that the first 8, and the process being then we select the final 6 specifically to make up for some of these differences or gaps in the diversity of the commission, that we would absolutely be thinking about identifying commissioners who have a Latino background. That being said, diversity comes in so many forms. So we were also looking at geography and what parts of the state folks were from, and trying to weigh potentially some of the expertise that people might be able to bring to the commission. Notably, our commission only had 1 attorney for a process that is, has a lot of legal ramifications and considerations in the process. So I think there's a number of factors there that we can think about in terms of representation, but certainly I am of the belief that racial, ethnic, gender representation does, of course, matter to the composition of the commission. This was a commission that was also majority female. Has that ever happened in the history of the United States in which a majority female body drew the 52 congressional districts? Guessing probably not. So
let's say we're the first.
Absolutely matters. Sorry?
Let's say we're the first.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we probably
and dare anyone to disprove it.
Yes,
I'm going to pull a question specifically for you as my final question for you, Professor Sadwhani, from the audience Q&A, which is how, if at all, did the potential loss, or it turns out the actual loss of a congressional district, impact the process and decisions? I assume that the questioner was talking about the district that's probably going to be lost in Los Angeles, which is very likely going to be a Hispanic district. So it's a good follow-on to what you were just talking about.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we didn't come in with a plan for where to take that district from. I think a lot of people thought that we had some sort of magic eraser, that we were going to come onto the current maps and erase a district and reform the lines around it. But we cleared the entire map. The lost seat, of course, did come from the Los Angeles area. Many would look at our maps and say that there was 2 districts that covered the Long Beach area and then another one further north. And now there's roughly 1 district in that area. So certainly I think it raised the stakes. I think we had a lot of participation in the process because of it, knowing that that somewhere someone was going to have very different kinds of political representation. But from a commissioner standpoint, it's not something that we stayed up thinking about. We were very clear that we were there to do this work on behalf of the people of California and to draw maps that would reflect communities on the ground to the greatest extent possible. And I think that's largely what we came away with. I saw also in the chat or the questions, a question about the East San Gabriel Valley. And I just wanted to respond to that. Of course, my own research specifically looks at Latino and Asian American representation and voting behavior. And I would just argue, I think the question was about the East San Gabriel Valley. I'm assuming the question is about our Senate maps. Previously, the Senate maps from 2010 had the East San Gabriel Valley, which is highly concentrated with Asian Americans connected to the western portion where there are more Latinos. That's actually a VRA area. And so ultimately we made the decision to separate the API community in the East San Gabriel Valley. If you take a look at our maps, we actually follow a very similar architecture in that region across all three maps. So I hope that answers the question that had been posed in the Q&A.
Thank you. Let me switch to Professor Warshaw. And my thoughts for you, Professor, are of the somewhat technical variety or conceptual in terms of how we classify or group our data. So what I think one of the underlying questions here for statistically analyzing voter grouping is the potential need for controlling for voluntary grouping of voters, the extent to which voters group themselves into consistent districts. And those districts may, they may be somewhat close to each other, adjacent, potentially contiguous. And so to what extent in your statistical grouping of voter maps are you accounting for the factor that the voters have grouped themselves into these areas versus whoever is drawing the map has artificially grouped these voters together? Is it possible to control for that?
Well, I want to answer that in a couple pieces. But first I want to step back. And I think in a democracy, from the point of view of making sure that all of us have equal voice in the government and that all of our views are represented, I think the goal of the redistricting process should be ensuring just that. And I think that in some ways, the geography of people clustering is kind of irrelevant for that. Like, I don't think we should be, if there was a severe geographic bias, which is often what you're talking about is used as sort of to justify one party having a partisan advantage in the redistricting process. Well, people will say like, oh, Democrats cluster in cities, too bad for Democrats. Or in a more democratic states, they'll say like, oh, Republicans are just kind of spread out, too bad for Republicans. And, I think as from a point of view of democratic theory, I think like, in some ways like that shouldn't be the benchmark. This geographic clustering like shouldn't be the benchmark. It should be making sure that all of our voices are represented in the government. And the way to do that is to have a vote seat curve where if you get half the votes, you should get half the seats. And I think that's what we should aspire to.
So that sounds like looking at an overall picture.
Sorry?
That sounds like the ultimate result should be to look at an overall picture. So for example, in California, so California largely resembles what you just described. The Democrats are grouped in the Bay Area and in Los Angeles, and the Republicans are largely thinly spread out through the rest of the state. So if you just drew a circle around the Bay Area and a circle around Los Angeles, that would pretty much capture all the Democrats and exclude all the Republicans. And yet the balance in the legislature would arguably still favor Democrats, even if that was the entire map for California. And from that perspective that you just articulated, that would be fairly representative of the population.
Yeah, so I think when you're evaluating a plan, you should evaluate it at the statewide level, and that goes for both partisan representation, but also representation for different racial groups or interests. Like my own view is, while community of interests and other things at the very local level matter, I think that in a legislature, the predominant thing is making sure the legislature as a whole represents equal people adequately and gives everyone equal voice. So then turning to the empirical question of how do you actually separate that out? So in my research, I typically evaluate it based on looking at changes in the partisan bias of a map or the partisan fairness of a map sort of before and after redistricting. So that in general, like right before and after redistricting, the geographical clustering of voters is not changing substantially. So if the map gets way more Democratic or way more Republican biased, like that can't be geography, right? That has to be something about the redistricting process. An alternative way to evaluate it is based on running essentially simulations where you draw maps, where you randomly kind of simulate thousands of different maps without using partisan considerations, and just sort of like see where the chips fall. And I think that scholars have used both of these general approaches to, in really useful ways.
So running random maps, is that, two questions. One is, what results do you get from doing that? Do you achieve relatively fair, nonpartisan, sort of representative maps by doing that? And how does the gestalt of those random maps compare with the maps that people actually use?
Yeah, so I should say there's a couple scholars. This is not something I do in my own research. So Jonathan Roden at Stanford and a number of other scholars have done really great work on this. And I think what they generally conclude is that in Eastern and Midwestern states, there tends to be a slight geographic advantage for Republicans because Democrats cluster in cities. It's less true in New England. There actually is generally a Democratic advantage because Republicans are so spread out that they can't actually, like in Massachusetts, there's basically no way you could draw congressional districts in Massachusetts such that Republicans would win a seat, because like everywhere there's a Democratic majority. And then in California, I think basically what people have found is that there's very little geographic bias in favor of either party, is what these simulations have shown, is that maybe there's actually a slight natural geographic advantage for Democrats in California. But I think, it varies. It's going to vary in different parts of the country which party has a geographic advantage.
So what are we left to conclude with the geographic and party distribution reality in some states, and with Massachusetts being sort of an extreme example of it? At the end of the day, if we're looking at this from a statewide macro level perspective, if the legislature actually represents the prevailing party in the state, whether it's Republicans or Democrats or whatever, then on the one hand, isn't that a metric for representativeness? How successful we're being at capturing the political views of the state, or even if we go to the other metric you mentioned of measuring the true up between the policies that the legislature actually enacts and if you polled statewide, so if the polling statewide matches up with the policies and the composition of the legislature by party matches up with the prevailing registration in the state, have we achieved fair representation?
Yeah, and my own view is that those are the kinds of metrics we should look to for fair representation. And I think that, typically, for instance, the way the partisan bias metrics work is that they're not actually assuming some sort of proportional representation. They typically assume that, if you get a majority of the votes, you should actually even do a little better than that in terms of the seats. But I think where you see the worst democratic distortions or distortions for democracy are in states like Wisconsin and Michigan, where one party won a majority of the votes, but a minority of the seats. And that's where you get, a government that can really be out of whack with sort of standards of democratic fairness. And I think those are the kinds of places where the ideological composition of the government is going to be really unrepresentative for what people, the mass public's preferences.
So in states like that, well, I don't want to call those states in particular, but in states where that and other similar metrics of the lack of representativeness exist, what remedies are potentially available to citizens in that state, to pursue reforms? So if you're an initiative state, you can potentially put something on the ballot through direct democracy. It used to be that federal courts were a good way to litigate Voting Rights Act cases, not so much anymore. You could try your state courts. Any other solutions you can think of?
Yeah, I think that obviously in a place where you can put a commission on the ballot and pass it, that's great. So Michigan did that this last cycle, as did a few other states, and that certainly has improved things. I think divide the political process is at least a partial remedy in the sense that divided government, even if you can't sort of toss out the state legislators because it's such a gerrymandered map, I think divided government can help. And we have, we've had a bunch of instances in the Midwest, particularly, where there's Democratic governors that have checked sort of gerrymandered Republican state legislators. And I think state courts can also play a role, but all of these to some extent are imperfect in places, as you said, without a ballot initiative. So I did some work this past cycle in Indiana, and this is a place with pretty gerrymandered maps. And there's no ballot initiatives there. So it's not obvious, what the remedy is for these gerrymandered maps. And I think that, this is an area where the Supreme Court getting more involved and at least, putting boundaries on how extreme the gerrymanders can be. I think that the kind of cases that went up to the Supreme Court last cycle were extreme partisan outliers. And I think that those are the kinds of outliers where in order for democracy to prevail, in some cases, you just need a court to step in and say that, you can't have one party that perpetuates itself in power forever.
I'm going to switch back to the gallery here. Thank you, Professor Warshaw. And so we have a number of very thoughtful and interesting audience questions. I don't think we have time to get to them all. So I'd rather start us with the 10 minutes that we have left with a fairly deep issue, and see if we can unpack that in the 10 minutes that we have. And then if we manage to get through this one issue in 10 minutes, I'll both be surprised, and I will try it and bring out another audience question. So the issue that I'm wondering if we can try to address now is to what extent is it accurate or useful to use race as a proxy for political affiliation, for policy preferences? It is often, and it makes sense to do so, used in that way. What makes a little more sense, and obviously is more objective, is actual party registration. If you're a registered Democrat, you're a Democrat. We don't have to infer anything. But it's fairly common in this kind of work, and we've touched on it in a couple places here today, to use race or ethnicity or affiliation with a particular demographic group as a proxy for partisan affiliation or policy preferences. To what extent do you folks feel like that is a valid way of proceeding? Is there another way that we can go about that? Discuss. We're going to solve racism in 9 minutes here.
I mean, I can just start out from the practitioner perspective. From the commission, we didn't use partisan data at all. So it wasn't something that we even looked at or contemplated. I understand, the perhaps desire to do so, but communities are actually are diverse and becoming more diverse, I think, to some extent, in many ways. For us, it was a non-issue, right? Because we were basing this on communities of interest testimony or VRA considerations when it came to race. The community of interest testimony sometimes would be about minority communities that would never, be large enough to develop a Section 2 VRA district around, like Pacific Islanders in the South Bay of Los Angeles County, or Asian Americans in various areas where they wouldn't necessarily otherwise qualify. The Vietnamese American community in Orange County, for example, they were highly mobilized and were calling in all of the time. And it was important for us to keep them together, and yet at the same time attempt at least to see through some of the partisan biases that might go with that testimony, and instead really focus on the geography of, well, where does this community actually lie, and are we keeping them together, as opposed to thinking about more broadly what the other cities that they might want to be connected with, which may or may not have been motivated from a partisan perspective. So, from a California perspective, it's not something we thought about or looked at in any systematic way.
Let's see if your colleagues have any thoughts.
Well, I'll just chime in and say, I think race is important for the redistricting process, in part because it is the debate between substantive and descriptive representation, in the sense, like, does it matter that the representatives resemble the voters in their districts? And I think there's a compelling argument that a lot of folks in the general public agree that is a vital characteristic. I think the historic importance of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act is such that it would be difficult to find another piece of federal legislation that has a more enduring mark on American society and the way things have changed after that legislation was enacted into law, and the sort of different procedures that brings along. But I'll also just mention that I think another vital characteristic is when you have a minority population that has different preferences than the majority population, when you have what we call racially polarized voting, in the absence of any protections for a racial minority, you end up with people who will always be on the losing end of a democratic, small d democratic electoral fight. And that doesn't engender much support for the legitimacy of democracy as an institution. And look to, say, Lonnie Guinier's great book, The Miner's Canary, when she was talking about if you have 5 kids deciding what game to play in the schoolyard and 3 want one and 2 want the other, those 2 will always lose. And democracy as an institution refers instead to values of pluralism, which means that eventually one party may be able to win. And in order to sort of reset the scales, we engage in things like drawing majority minority districts precisely to allow for the expression of views that may not be present in the presence of, say, racially polarized voting.
Professor Warshaw. So one of the factors I think we could address here is the extent to which it's true that a minority population's political views change or differ from the assumption. Hispanics in the last 8 years or so being potentially the best example. In 2016 and 2020, Hispanic voters trended up in Republican registration and voting, which I think surprised and chagrined a lot of Democrats. So it's an illustration of this question of the utility. Not questioning the points, the very valid points that you folks have made already, but it's race as a proxy for policy preferences or partisan affiliation. It has some problems potentially. Professor Warshaw.
Well, I think that what I would say is I agree with everything that Sara and Peter said. I think we ought to have, I think for me, the main reason to that for this matters is we ought to have a government that looks like America for a wide variety of different reasons. But I will say, I think that we don't need to consider the policy. I think there's a number of reasons why you want a government that looks like America, sort of building on some of the things Peter said beyond the policy preferences. And one example of that has been some really great studies that focus mostly on malapportionment in the 1960s and on the Voting Rights Act in the 1960s that found when communities get more representation in the legislature, they tend to get more stuff from the government. And if the democratic process sort of writ large consistently means that certain groups aren't able to actually elect anybody to the legislature, then their schools are going to be underfunded. The roads in those places are not going to be as good. And I think in order to have a democracy where everybody's schools get equal voice, everybody's roads get equal consideration, everybody has to be able to elect people to the legislature.
Well, we have about 2 or 3 minutes left. I'll open it up to the floor. Any closing thoughts?
Just to chime in on this conversation one last time, and I know we were supposed to have closing thoughts, but I absolutely agree with you, David, right? I mean, using race as a proxy for party, even here in California, can be really problematic. I mean, right now, separate from redistricting, I'm kind of tracking the mayor's race in Los Angeles, a field of Democrats. So you can no longer just simply assume that there's one candidate of choice for any specific community. And I think there's a lot of conversation right now about, the fact that parties need to do the work to invest in communities of color if they want to rely on them to be a part of their voting coalition. And I think that should be the lesson learned of the 2020 election. Just in terms of some closing thoughts, I think one of the things that probably a lot of people know, but that I didn't note regarding this conversation of race was that certainly the number of Latino majority minority districts increased significantly here in the state of California. In our current congressional map, according to PPIC, there were 10 Latino majority districts. Our final congressional map that we passed and adopted has 16 seats and is now much more closer to proportional to the number of Latinos that call California home.
Thank you. Professor Warshaw, Professor Miller, any closing thoughts?
I'll let Chris go first.
I think redistricting, and as we've all been talking about, I think that these issues are fundamental in our democracy. And at the end of the day, the people that we elect to the government through the legislative elections are the ones that set the policies, that determine what roads and schools get funded, that pass the laws. So having a redistricting process that enables everybody's voice to equal weight is really crucially important. And I think that we've made progress on these issues in the past couple of years, particularly through more nonpartisan commissions. But I hope in the years to come, as a country, we continue to figure out how we can have a more fair redistricting process.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'll just echo Chris's point and say the sort of institutional design comes in, where I think we're constantly relearning how the sort of malevolent forces out there operate. And I think like the one thing that motivated the redistricting revolution cases in the 60s was an idea of equal population will bring fairness. And sure, it brings one form of fairness, but other forms of bias have now emerged. And there's a larger conversation about how to counteract these new elements that arise in the process of redrawing electoral districts.
Yeah, there's definitely a whack-a-mole dynamic. You close one avenue to corruption or gaming the process, and creative minds will find another. So there's always this aspect of sort of chasing the last strategy, fighting the last war. To me, one of the big takeaways is that at least now, with the problems we face currently, the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission is far and away the best solution to the set of problems that we face now. California, as usual, is a leader in this regard and has come up with arguably the best system for dealing with, again, the slate of problems that we face now. I'm sure it will have to adapt to new and creative techniques or population shifts or changes in party affiliations. The ball keeps rolling downhill. Politics is anything but static. But as far as a procedural solution or a design solution to this set of problems that we faced recently, I submit, and I think the data shows this, that California's process is a model to be followed. So I certainly hope that the other direct democracy states all put this on their ballots as well. We're out of time. I want to thank our distinguished panel for their excellent presentations. The audience has been very engaged. We had about 50 people on today, and I received a barrage of questions that unfortunately I didn't have time to work all of them in. But we did get some of them out there. So Professor Sadwhani, Professor Warshaw, Professor Miller, thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this. To everyone that's still in the audience, I hope you enjoyed this as well, and get out there and exercise the franchise. We'll end it there. Thank you everyone.